All right, let's dive into a really big shift in U.S. trade policy. We're talking about Executive Order 14257, and it's rolling out something called the Reciprocal Tariff. Now, the document itself, it's pretty dense, but the core idea is actually pretty simple, and trust me, it's going to make some serious waves in global trade.
And this order, wow, it does not mess around. It kicks right off with this incredibly powerful declaration of a national emergency. I mean, that's about as urgent as it gets in government language. So you have to ask, right? What's the threat that's so big it justifies a move like this?
Well, according to the order, that threat has a number, and it's a big one, $1.2 trillion. That's the size of the U.S. goods trade deficit for 2024. And this document basically says that huge number is the root of the problem this whole policy is trying to fix.
So that brings us to the first big idea here. How do you take an economic number, the trade deficit, and turn it into a full-blown national emergency? Let's take a look at how they justify it.
The order's main argument is all about connecting those dots. It's saying these massive, ongoing trade deficits, they're not just numbers on a page. They're an unusual and extraordinary threat that puts both the U.S. economy and, maybe more importantly, its national security at risk.
Okay, so if the trade deficit is the threat, what's causing it? The order points to one very specific reason, which brings us to our next section, the reciprocity problem.
Reciprocity, that's the key word here. You can think of it as just basic fairness in trade. It's like, hey, I'll keep my taxes on your stuff low if you keep your taxes on my stuff low. But the whole argument of this executive order is that this simple principle has been thrown out the window, creating a system that's just fundamentally unfair.
And this chart, this really puts that idea into perspective. It shows the average tariff rates, basically the standard tax countries put on imports. Now look at the U.S. rate. It's way down at 3.3%. Okay, now compare that. The European Union is at 5%, China's at 7.5%, and India all the way up at 17%. The order uses this as Exhibit A for an uneven playing field. And let's make it even more real with an example we can all get, cars. So, the U.S. tariff on a car coming into the country is just 2.5%. But check this out. If an American company wants to sell a car in the EU, boom, a 10% tariff. In China, it jumps to 15%. This is exactly the kind of imbalance this new order is designed to tackle.
But the document says, hey, it's not just about tariffs. It also points a finger at all these other non-tariff barriers. You could think of these as the hidden hurdles, right? Things like super complicated licensing rules, not enough protection for intellectual property, and even currency practices that just make it that much harder for U.S. products to get a fair shake overseas. Okay, so the order lays out a problem, this lack of reciprocity. But what does that actually mean in the real world? What are the results of this imbalance? Well, that leads us right into our third section, the consequences for America. And again, the language here is incredibly blunt. The order claims these trade imbalances have literally led to the hollowing out of American manufacturing. And even more seriously, it says this has weakened the country's defense industrial base so much that it's now dependent on foreign adversaries. That is a huge statement. And the document puts a number on the human side of this. It cites the loss of about 5 million manufacturing jobs in the U.S. just between 1997 and 2024. It frames this as one of the biggest drops in the country's entire history. Now here's a really fascinating point the author makes. You might look at manufacturing and think, it's only 11% of GDP, not a huge piece of the pie. But, and this is the key, it's an absolute giant when it comes to innovation. It accounts for 70% of all R&D spending. So the argument is, when you lose manufacturing, you're not just losing jobs, you're losing your main engine for future growth and new technology. And this problem isn't just about factories. The order makes a point to talk about agriculture too. This is a sector where the U.S. used to always have a trade surplus. Well, that's flipped. Now it's looking at a projected $49 billion annual deficit. That really suggests the issue is systemic, spreading across the economy. All right, so we've laid out the problem and the supposed consequences. So what's the actual fix? That's what Section 4 is all about, the reciprocal tariff solution. First up, a quick definition. The order imposes something called an ad valorem duty. It sounds complicated, but it's really not. It's just a tax that's a percentage of the value of whatever's being imported. So a more expensive item pays more in tariffs, a cheaper one pays less. Simple as that. And the rollout for this? It's designed to be incredibly fast. It's happening in two main steps.
First, on April 5th, 2025, a baseline 10% extra tariff gets slapped on almost all imports. But that's just phase one. Just 4 days later, on April 9th, a whole new set of much higher country-specific tariffs kick in.
And this table gives you an idea of what those country-specific rates are going to look like. And remember, this is on top of any tariffs that already exist. So for the European Union, the rate jumps to 20%. For China, 34%. And for a country like Vietnam, it's a massive 46%. We are talking about a huge, sweeping increase across the board.
Okay, for our last section, let's get into some of the important details, the fine print, if you will, about how this new reciprocal tariff is actually going to work. So, one crucial thing to know is that this new tariff doesn't hit everything. The order has a long list of exemptions for goods that are considered strategically important. We're talking about things like critical minerals, semiconductors, a lot of pharmaceuticals, and energy products. These are all carved out basically to avoid messing up essential supply chains.
Another really big exception is for our North American neighbors. The order is very clear that goods coming in from Canada and Mexico that qualify under the current USMCA trade deal, well, they're not going to be subject to these new duties. This basically keeps the North American trading bloc playing by a different set of rules.
And that brings us to one last really crucial detail. The order gives the president the power to change these tariffs, to raise or lower them depending on how other countries react. So will they fight back with their own tariffs, or will they come to the table and cooperate? This built-in flexibility leaves us with the biggest question of all. How is this single order about to reshape America's trade relationships with the entire world?